via Brooklyn Digital.
Hello, and welcome to another Still the Podcast film review episode. In addition to our regular episodes, we are bringing you book and film reviews that delve into issues that relate to female-identifying artists in the arts and entertainment industry. I'm Danielle Joy.
And I'm Cori Hundt.
And today we will be talking about the film Joy, directed by Ben Taylor from a screenplay written by Jack Thorne and co-created by Jack Thorne and Rachel Mason.
As the discussion continues today, spoilers may be revealed. So if you don't want to have anything divulged ahead of time, please consider listening to another episode of our podcast and coming back here once you've watched the film, which you can catch on Netflix as of the release of this episode.
According to Wikipedia, Joy is a 2024 British biographical drama film starring Bill Nighy, Thomasin McKenzie, and James Norton. It is the true story of the world's first in vitro fertilization baby, Louise Brown. Based on real events in the 1960s and the 1970s, nurse and embryologist Jean Purdy, visionary scientist Dr. Robert Edwards, and innovative surgeon Patrick Steptoe worked to develop the first test tube baby. Content warning, pregnancy complications.
And just a reminder for our new listeners that in this podcast, we use the term female identifying. However, sometimes we do just say the word women, by which we mean it inclusively as anyone who identifies as female. We will continue to do our best throughout this podcast series to use the proper terminology and educate ourselves as preferred syntax continues to evolve.
So we like to start off this film and review podcasting series by asking why we chose the film or book that we chose. So Cori, why did you choose to watch this film?
So why did I choose the film Joy? So for this one in particular, before I had even tried to watch it myself, I had 3 different people individually reach out to me and be like, Cori, you need to watch this film. So, I mean, obviously I will get into why, but I was like, oh, okay, everyone keeps reaching out to me and being like, you need to catch this on Netflix while it's on there. So the reason that so many people have been reaching out to me about this film in particular, I think we might have alluded to it on other podcast episodes, and Ian and I are very open about this, but our daughter was conceived through IVF and I have an endometriosis diagnosis. And I didn't even realize, I knew it was obviously about the first IVF baby, Louise Brown, but I didn't realize that endometriosis played such a huge role in this movie. I really was not prepared for that at all. And as somebody with endometriosis, I've never seen kind of a mainstream film with it mentioned or playing such a central role to the movie. And I have to say, it just feels very, when we talk about representation matters, it really, I think, means a lot to the endometriosis and probably the larger reproductive illness community and IVF community to kind of see this representation in a mainstream Netflix film with such huge stars attached to it. And so, yeah, a lot of people kind of knew this was my cup of tea in terms of, it's a British biographical film, had me there. It's about reproductive illness, had me there. It's about IVF. I was like, okay, clearly this is a film meant for Cori to watch. And that's why so many people reached out to me. So kudos to everyone who told me to catch this. Thank you for the recommendation. I thought it was great. And I'd love to get more into that. But that was my kind of reason. I know Danielle, then I said, oh, why don't we talk about this for the podcast? And I think one of the reasons it really ties in for this is also that it's trying to give credit to one of the 3 founders of IVF, Jean Purdy, who is often left behind in acknowledgement. So I don't know, Danielle, if you want to chat a little bit more about that and how that was so central also to the theme of the movie.
Yeah, well, I just have to say that when you texted me that we should watch this film Joy that everyone had told you to watch, I was like, the film with Jennifer Lawrence about Home Shopping Network?
I did realize that. And when I was looking up on Netflix, there were like 4 other movies titled Joy. And I just thought, oh, that's an interesting choice considering how many. I mean, Louise Brown's middle name is Joy, apparently chosen. The family let the fertility team choose it and they chose the middle name Joy. So that's why. But
yes,
you're right. I was like, oh yeah, there was a giant film not that long ago also called Joy. You're like, that's a weird choice, Cori, but okay.
I know, I was surprised. Well, you just said it too. I was going to mention it later, but so the movie is called Joy because her name is Louise Joy Brown, and my name is Danielle Joy, but Joy is actually my middle name. So
Da, da, da.
I also have the same middle name as
That's
the first in
right.
vitro baby. So I thought that was kind of cool that we share this a little bit with them.
Yeah.
But yeah, so you texted me about this and you said lots of people had told you to watch it, and I thought it was just about the IVF as well. And then as soon as they mentioned the endometriosis, I was like, oh, well, this is probably Cori probably knew about this, but you're saying that you didn't even know about that.
I just thought it was about the IVF baby because I looked a little bit more into it actually because they make it a central part of the film. Again, spoiler, that they say that Jean Purdy has severe endometriosis, and they kind of put this angle on it that she can't have children of her own. So one of the reasons she wanted to do this was to help other women be able to have children if they so desire. And apparently there's no kind of literature published about whether she actually had endometriosis, but I did see a Time article that said one of the doctors who worked with her, a physiologist, Roger Gostin, who worked under Edwards, who was one of the three in the trio who created IVF. So the quote goes, when asked whether Purdy had endometriosis, Mason tells Time she did, adding, it's really important that women speak up about such things as endometriosis, women's issues. And I would like to imagine that she would, meaning if Purdy were alive today. And sorry, Mason is a reference to Rachel Mason, one of the co-creators. And so I guess the writing team looked into this and found a doctor who I guess had a personal conversation maybe, or felt like they had this knowledge on a firsthand basis rather than a medical record or something, like a conversational piece with Purdy. So the writing team feels that it was true. Maybe that's kind of why they ran with it. But I guess there's nothing, I guess she was also a very private person is what this article was saying. And so some of it, again, it's fictionalized based on true events. So there's perhaps some creative license taken too. It's talking about her relationships with people she worked with and how much of a disease she had, or how much that was really part of the drive for her to kind of do this specific work. So that was something I kind of wanted to look into more as well about her, because they made it so prominent in the movie about whether she really did have endo or not. So the writing team seems to think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they made it prominent in the movie, but also no one in the movie knew except for one other person. They made Steptoe the one who found out about it. So while the audience knew a lot about it and how progressed it was for her, no one else in the film knew that she had endometriosis. So while it was a main point of the movie, it wasn't a main point of the movie.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, it's one of the where the audience was let in on the knowledge, but she eventually told her mother years later as her mother was dying, and told the one doctor she worked with. And then there was a conversation where she said, does he know too? And he said, oh, probably, because you probably know things about me that I thought I didn't tell you. And she was like, oh, okay.
But not about endo, just about the fact that she can't have kids.
Oh, you don't think that specifically the endo diagnosis?
Yeah, I don't think he knew specifically.
Maybe just that she couldn't have kids. Okay.
Yeah, because she wasn't ever like trying to or talked about it or anything like that. So I think it was just assumed that she either didn't want them or couldn't have them. But given the work they were in and how passionate she was about it, it stands to assume that she was unable to because she threw herself into this work. But they also talked about in the film, there was an ectopic pregnancy.
Blocked fallopian tubes.
Yeah. So lots of other issues.
Abortion they talked about.
And then the whole religious aspect of everything, where Jean Purdy was a very religious person and she saw what she was doing as helping people, but other people in her church community said that, no, you're doing horrible things. Even though she wasn't performing abortions, she was working with someone who did. And then if there was an ectopic pregnancy, obviously they had to sort that out. So
I think that was one of the most profound, if we're talking about things that stuck out from the film, realizing what they had to go through in order to make this science available. And they talk a lot about that in terms of, oh, this is a science and it's different than the court of public opinion and what the public opinion thinks about it, and that infertility is a disease. And so the movie takes place, in the late 60s and the 70s, and it really shows you a specific time in England and the UK, greater UK at the time, about the religion involved, about what society thought about how far women's health had come. And by that, I mean, not very far, but there's this whole scene in the lecture where they're trying to talk about laparoscopic surgery and they're saying, oh, that's like pseudoscience and that's dangerous. And now that's the standard, which is crazy. Like I even think, I feel like this is going to be a dive into Cori's medical history on this podcast. But,
whatever you're comfortable talking about.
But no, I had an appendectomy as a child and they were still doing it open at the time. So when people ask, now it's keyhole almost, unless it's like so severe they really need to see more. But now it's all laparoscopic and keyhole. And that was like probably 1999 or something like that. But I was alive in the time before, certain surgeries even used laparoscopic procedures. And so to see on film the beginning of when laparoscopic surgery was created and how, again, that was considered hearsay as well. And I was actually surprised, I will say, as someone who knows a lot about endometriosis, that they even had a name for it in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, I was shocked at that too.
Because maybe it was because these were the medical professionals who were the top of their field who were saying these terms, but I feel like a lot of times it was just, oh, you're infertile or you're barren or even today, how often they're like, oh, we just don't know, but it's really endo. So it's something that I was really surprised with.
Yeah, I was also surprised too when they mentioned it because I was like, wait, did they know about endometriosis in the 60s? Because nowadays people just think it doesn't exist still.
Yeah, I was shocked.
The surgeon, Steptoe, he even said to Jean, you must be in a lot of pain. Is there anything I can do for you? He knew that endometriosis was associated with pain. And I feel like doctors now don't take endometriosis pain seriously.
Isn't that crazy?
At all. So I was shocked at that. So I was curious about that too. Did they know about that in the 60s or is this sort of,
the fictionalized part of it?
Yeah.
I did notice in the scene where they do the exam on Purdy in the end, again, spoiler alert, sorry. And the Time article that I read reiterated this. I was like, you can't tell the severity of endo from a pelvic exam. That's not how that works.
I was curious about that too.
No, because you need either an ultrasound and or laparoscopic surgery and biopsy, which was again at the forefront of technology and not widely done by then. So they did mention in the Time article that, that's Time magazine saying like that's not realistic, that part of the movie. They wouldn't have been able to tell that now. So there were some things obviously that are fictionalized or not medically accurate, but honestly, there's so little conversation about this that you're happy for any.
Yeah, they got it wrong, but at least they're talking about it.
Literally, that's where we are. And we're 2025. How many years later are we from when this movie took place? When you think about it?
60 years.
Crazy.
Wow.
Were there any other scenes that really stuck out to you?
Well, I also wanted to just go back to what you said about realizing the hardships that they had to face and the things they had to go through, not only with religious groups and churches and communities they were part of, but also the social and the medical board not wanting to give them any funding because they didn't see it as a medical necessity, but also the space they were in. The hospital that they were in was a wing of a hospital that was disused and the ceiling was falling in. There was no glass on the windows. And they're doing exact medical science with microscopic cells. These women were getting eggs taken out of them in these conditions that were not super sterile.
They were also doing it laparoscopically, which, and I'm sure this is, shows the evolution of science, but you don't do it like through your abdomen anymore. The commitment to do something like this. But yeah, this sacrifice and how they were just thrown in this outbuilding. But then the flip side of that, how they have these scenes where they say hundreds and hundreds of women are sending in these letters, just dying to be part of this program, this experimental program, which has never yet worked before, just at a chance for this. And so it shows you that really interesting dichotomy. And again, the medical board scene was interesting because they said, oh, well, it really affects so few women, so few people.
They say to them in that meeting, they're like, you don't get the letters. You don't know how many people it affects.
And how taboo I think it was back then. I mean, I still think in many ways it's very taboo to talk about in 2025. And I think people were just so shamed or secretive about it because they felt they had to be. And so the fact that it just wasn't known. And I mean, and you look at endometriosis affects 1 in 10 people born female. And that's 5% of the world population has endometriosis. And so to sit there and be like, oh, this is such a small percentage of people, it's like a wild thing to have said.
Even if it affects one person, that person's life is still worthy of being comfortable and getting what they need and want in life and being able to reproduce if they want.
And that's something that, I mean, I guess I'm trying not to go on my, because I have like a whole advocacy side to this and not go
Step on
crazy.
your soapbox, Cori.
Step on my soapbox. But so many, and again, it's not so much people in my direct sphere in life who are getting more progressive, more liberal, and just, I guess, I don't know, nicer. I don't know. Maybe that's not. No, but there's these people, and I see them on the internet. I do. It's literally, it's a medical issue, and that they had that line, which so I really connected with in the board meeting where they're asking for funding, and this is a medical issue, and we're trying to solve infertility with science because it's a medical issue, and it becomes the crossover with religion is so great, and with societal norms, and this being scared of the unknown, but really, it's just if somebody has cancer, someone has diabetes, if somebody has any other chronic illness or disease, you try and usually with modern medicine, Western medicine, to treat it, or even holistic or Eastern medicine tries to treat these things in a different way. But to sit there and just be like, oh no. And there was an audience member in the interview, the one interview scene, who said, oh, that's a God's choice. Or the woman in the board meeting said, like, oh, that's nature's way of balancing out
overpopulation. Yeah, I was going to say that was one of the things that really stuck out for me was the overpopulation line, because he refutes it. Edwards refutes it and says one is not the cause of the other.
Infertile people shouldn't be penalized for the over fertileness of other people. It's not infertile people's cross to bear. Someone wants to have 8 kids. It doesn't mean that the person who wants one child, be happy with one child, should be punished, and that we shouldn't put medical research funding into it.
He said something about one is not the solution to the other.
Yes.
Letting infertile people be infertile is not the solution to overpopulation.
And they also often, I guess the go-to lines were about like, oh, should we not have spectacles? And should we not have false teeth? And things like this. It is wild. Having a reproductive illness is wild, because I have to think that if you break your arm, most people in the world aren't going to be like, don't give them a cast, don't give them painkillers, don't get an x-ray. Most people will be like, yeah, those are perfectly normal things we as humans came up with to help advance our health and our longevity and our quality of life. But for some reason, whether it's societal norms or religious norms, anything to do with reproductive illness, and I think this gets into a larger conversation, but especially if we're talking IVF, like this movie, it becomes like a moral thing. You don't deserve to have a child because your disease happens to be of the reproductive tract, instead of you broke your arm or you need insulin because you have diabetes. For some reason, it becomes like a moral issue instead of just being a medical science issue, which is what they talk a lot about in the film. They talk a lot about in terms of this is a scientific issue.
Yeah, and it's similar with abortion as well. So you see Jean wrestle with this because she believes religiously that abortion is bad, and that when she finds out that Dr. Steptoe is doing abortions in the hospital that she works in, she gets really upset, and she didn't realize that was happening right under her nose. But they say God says you can't perform abortions because God wanted you to have that baby, or they wanted you to have complications with that baby and not make it, right? Like that's God's plan. And similarly, you have to stay infertile because God made you infertile.
Well, I think the next leap is, oh, well, if God gave you cancer, then no chemo. God meant for you to die. And so that's always the thing that gets me. Oh, so when it involves my reproductive tract, it's a moral issue. But if I have melanoma, you're not going to say just let it spread and die. But right. For some reason with endo or these other issues, it's like just you can't do anything because it's supposed to be that way. And it's like that's a wild jump from cancer's fine, endo's not.
So Jean's mother in the movie, and I guess in real life, had cancer.
I believe lung cancer was the insinuation.
But you see Jean giving her medicine. And to your point, why does she get medicine to help ease her suffering and pain? And nowadays we can treat cancer, but why can't Jean work on treating infertility? I get so frustrated when you see people in all these talking heads or like on the news or something getting interviewed, men on the street style, and they're like, this is a terrible thing. Women shouldn't have abortion. God didn't want to do it this way. And then I'm just like, oh, but you were you born that shade of blonde? Have you ever cut your hair or painted your nails?
How many things have you altered? Did you have braces?
Have you ever brushed your teeth? Have you ever had glasses? Have you ever put makeup on? Did you ever break a bone? Do you take blood pressure medication?
Right. Where is the line and why is that the line?
If you believe that God gave you this medicine to help you live your life or gave you hair dye to help you change your hair, God created all this because he created man. Where's the leap? Why can't you make this one little leap saying maybe God is behind the science?
Yeah, and I understand it does. And they really did a good job, I think, of showing that wrestling that people today still have. And I think this brings up a really interesting line and point that Muriel, the matron, made when I think it was during the abortion conversation, when she goes, the point is we're trying to give choice, women choice. And that's whether they don't want a baby or whether they do want a baby. The important thing is they get to choose. I understand if they get accidentally pregnant, they don't want an abortion. Fine, you choose. Absolutely. You choose to have the baby. The issue I take is when you get to then decide about me. Or if I know people who say, I just couldn't do IVF, and I want to respect them. I get it. If you don't feel you could do IVF, then don't do IVF. But you don't get to tell me I can't do IVF. And I think Muriel put it so perfectly when she goes, it's about the choice for the woman, and we're trying to give every choice so the woman can make the choice. And I thought that was a really powerful line that they had.
And I think that's what turned Jean as well. That really made her stop and think and then realize that, yeah, that's exactly what she's doing. And that whether she would not opt that for herself, given the situation, but she would have a choice. She would have that choice. But based on her religious belief, she probably wouldn't.
There was a conversation that Jean had with her mother saying it's legal, because at that point in England, it was legal abortion. And so there was that conversation. And I think the insinuation was that she didn't speak to her mother for a long time, maybe even years, until the mother was really dying, and not because Jean didn't want to. Oh, and that was another interesting conversation she had with the mother. And it wasn't about abortion, it was about just IVF. Because the mother said, if you choose to do this, then you're not choosing me. And Jean said something like, but IVF isn't making me choose between IVF and you. You're making me choose between IVF and you.
Yeah.
And it's not the work I'm doing that's putting me in this position. You're putting me in this position. And so I thought that was a really interesting conversation piece as well. And it did a good job of both paying heed to the science and the status of women's reproductive health care at that time period, but I think also really balancing it with the morality issues, where when you look at the headlines or you look at the video clips from this time period, how it was treated broadly in the media. They were called Frankenstein, and they were told they were playing God and they were being immoral and all these things. And to continue through I'm speaking now from like the medical perspective, the trio, the doctors or the two doctors and Jean who made this happen, to go against all that, how difficult it must have been at the time.
Yeah, I also wanted to just talk about the women who were part of the study and how they called themselves the Ovum Club. I thought that was really cute, and how they sort of bonded. And there was a scene where they all went down to the water, and Jean was talking to one of the women about another woman who had gotten pregnant. She was the first one who was confirmed pregnancy, and they were all out there to celebrate her. And Jean was talking to another woman, and they were both staring at her. And Jean just says, I'm jealous of her too. And it didn't even work. That first one didn't even work, but they were just jealous that she was able to.
And I think it's interesting because I think a lot of women feel in the infertility community feel guilt at how they feel towards other people's pregnancies. And I think it's really important to note the phrasing I've heard is that they're not upset at the pregnant person. They're upset for their own situation. They're grieving for their own situation. So they're not sitting there thinking, I wish she wasn't pregnant, or I hope this goes horribly for her. There's just such a deep grief, that jealousy, I think it's very real to sit there and be like, what is it about me or my situation that I can't be like that? I wish it were me. Because as you said, they're very supportive of this other woman. But yeah, I thought that was a really important moment in the film. And I think without saying it, because they didn't know Jean was leading the study, but there's kind of a bonding moment that they wrote. Again, this is probably fictionalized, between the woman and Jean, who is not pregnant. And I think that really speaks to how a lot of people in the infertility world feel at points along their journey.
Yeah. I just want to go back also to just about how the money letters that people wrote, that women wrote to be a part of the study, and how you were saying there's a lot of shame around either not being able to have a child or getting IVF because people were against it. But also just thinking about the time period back in the 60s, 70s, but for the most part, women didn't work and weren't allowed to have their own bank accounts. So literally their whole worth was tied up in whether or not they could have a child. And they were told, marry a husband, have kids, be a homemaker, be a mother, be a wife. And because they couldn't, I think that's why so many of them really desperately wanted into this study, because even the chance that they could fulfill this societal 2 kids, a dog, and a picket fence fantasy that was going on back then. Otherwise, they didn't know what their worth was. And it's just so upsetting to me that they didn't have any other way of defining their worth. And who knows what the husbands were like? What happens if the husband finds out that they're never going to have kids? Do they divorce them? They have no power over their bodies and over what's going to happen to them in this relationship.
Yeah. And I think a side note to talk about is also because it very much, I mean, some of these women did have diagnoses, but, a number of infertility cases are unexplained infertility is what they call it. And male factor infertility ranges somewhere, they think, between like 20 to 30%. So also some of these women are probably sitting there being like, I feel so horrible. We don't have answers and we don't know. And it's probably the male in certain cases too, I think is also important to not, again, it doesn't help to necessarily play a blame game just from a scientific point of view in terms of trying to rectify the situation to know, and sometimes it's both, but that's something as well that I think is just interesting to note about the situation, because I'm sure there's a lot of discussion about how it destroys families and marriages and people's lives, especially when you don't have answers. Or back then, the science, as we know, it didn't exist yet. And to hear that there was some ray of hope, I mean, people were knocking down the doors of this program, this experimental program, to be part of it.
Do we want to talk about the book ending of the beginning of the movie to the end of the movie and what they talk about? You did a bit of research on this.
Yeah, so I thought it was really interesting how they structured it. And it wasn't a huge thing, but they started and ended talking about, so for those who don't know or might not have traveled to the UK, in places where people lived who made significant contributions, they think, to UK life, that could be scientific or sport or art, they have these blue plaques outside of where they spent, I think, like their largest part of their residency. And so it's to honor people who've achieved what they consider to be great things. And according to Wikipedia, in 1980, a plaque was planned to honor the development of IVF. The plaque's text, as approved by administrators, excluded Purdy's name. Edwards protested against this omission, but his objections were rejected by an administrator. The Oldham NHS Trust received a letter of complaint from Edwards in 1981. In his 1989 autobiography, Edwards maintained Purdy's importance and described the core team as a threesome. Purdy's importance was recognized following the publication of Edwards' papers in the 2010s. In 2015, Professor Andrew Steptoe of the Royal Society of Biology, Patrick Steptoe's son, unveiled a blue plaque that acknowledged the 3 people involved in developing IVF. In 2018, to mark the 40th anniversary of IVF, Bourne Hall unveiled a memorial to Jean Purdy, the world's first IVF nurse and embryologist, co-founder of the Bourne Hall Clinic. So they started off by talking about the blue plaque and saying she needs to be part of it. And so I think taking excerpts of these letters and saying it wasn't just us two, she was an integral part. And the movie delves into how they were going to give up after the first years of it, when they were getting people pregnant, but they weren't staying pregnant. And they were saying that she decided, and again, I don't know if this is fictionalized or not, but she decided to change the technique. So basically they were waiting and preserving, but they basically came up with fresh IVF, which is when you take it out, you let it grow for 3 days and put it right back in line with a woman's natural cycle instead of over medicating it. And that's what ended up working for Leslie Brown, who's the mother of Louise Brown. Leslie and John Brown are the parents of the first IVF baby. So they insinuated from the film, at least, that she was was integral in coming back after this break, after her mother died, and figuring out a different technique that ended up working for IVF. And IVF has come, much farther from there. They were usually just doing one egg at a time and again, taking it through the abdomen and all sorts of things. But in terms of actually working, so she was integral to this. And so at the end, they allude to the blue plaque again. And I thought that was a really nice structure to the film. And I think that was one of the reasons it made so much sense to talk about on this podcast as well. The woman who was part of the scientific process.
The scientific breakthrough.
The scientific breakthrough here, exactly. And really the first embryologist. That's an entire field. That's an entire study nowadays. But she basically created the field of embryology, if you think about it. She was the one who... So it's not the, they call me in this country, reproductive endocrinologist, or in the UK, basically your fertility doctor, OBGYNs who specialize in fertility issues. So that's kind of the doctor you see, but there's a specific scientist nowadays who they just handle the embryos. They're testing the embryos. They're making sure they're healthy. They're choosing the best ones. They're doing the insemination in the lab. And so that's its own field, its own specialty, its own training, its own technique. And she was the first embryologist by all accounts and measures. And they just ignored her for decades.
So that made me cry. You reading that out, by the way. I was just crying a little bit. But also, the new plaque was unveiled in 2015, 30 years after she died?
So it's 2015. So she died. Also, important to note, she died at 39 of melanoma. And they said she worked until the end. They brought a cot into the lab, essentially. This was this was her life's work.
So she saw the first plaque, and then Edwards immediately fought. She saw him fighting and then succumbed to melanoma, and then 30 years after she died.
And I think it's wonderful that both Edwards to the end and Steptoe's son, who clearly followed, I don't know much about Steptoe's son, but clearly followed in his father's footsteps if he was part of the Royal Society of Biology. Royal Society of Biology.
I didn't cry much during the movie, but now I'm crying just thinking about it again.
Oh, yeah. I tried to be stoic during the movie.
I didn't try to be stoic.
A mess.
I know, but it's just talking about it now, it feels more real when we're talking about the real people, whereas it sort of gets that separation of fictionalization on the screen. You know,
and
you're
I thought
watching
they did
actors.
a great job. I thought they did an amazing job acting, and I thought the screenplay was wonderful. This is talking about personal connections to it. The next thing we definitely want to mention. So Thorne and Mason, the co-creators, are actually a couple. And I think one of the reasons they set out to create this film is because in the Time magazine article, it says that they went through 7 rounds of IVF before giving birth to their baby boy. And they said that Thorne says he hopes that the film will be a conversation starter that encourages families to talk openly about their fertility journeys and any health matters. And there's another quote from Mason earlier as well about how important it is to talk openly about endometriosis. And we feel that if we think that today Jean Purdy would do that if she did have it, kind of a thing. So I think that also, I think what they did is a great thing, that they put the time and energy and attention into this, because I think people forget how it was only Louise Brown, she's 40, I think she's 46 now.
Yeah, she's young.
Yeah.
When I heard that, I was like, wait, she's not that much older than I am.
Yeah. Because I think about how many friends and people I know who've done IVF now. And I think about my parents' generation. And really, if you think about like how old we are, it was a very, very new science, probably not that accessible. I mean, there's still that separate podcast, very inaccessible today, but not nearly as accessible as it is in 2025. And I think it was very much unknown, and the success rates weren't as high. They also aren't, just to say, I think a lot of people think IVF is a solution for things. It actually doesn't work most of the time. I
was just about to ask you, hearing about the 7 rounds, I was going to ask you if you knew the stats of success rate.
So there's different ways to look at it, because they do it sometimes by age. There's also different reasons people do IVF nowadays, because obviously in this movie they're talking about infertility, especially female infertility, but LGBTQ families use it a lot nowadays. People who have known genetic diseases that are really serious that they don't want to pass down, or if both parents are carriers, they can use IVF to factor out people who want to be single parents by choice. So it covers a whole range of issues now, whereas originally, as the movie explores, it was to start off with focused on female infertility, but there's kind of a whole range. So it depends. IVF, I think also there's like overall statistics, but then it also depends what your, I guess, reason is. Because if you're otherwise healthy and you have like a sperm donor because you're in a relationship where, for instance, a lesbian relationship, then you're probably going to have a higher chance of success than someone who has severe reproductive issues.
Yeah. And that was another thing that they talked about in the movie was Edwards would go on these TV programs to defend IVF. And one of the scientists that they had on like as a, back and forth on one of these TV programs was the one who found out about DNA or, discovered DNA. And all of those discoveries led to being able to gene splice and mess with DNA. And he's like, what's the difference between that you won the Nobel Prize for?
Yours was considered, abnormal. Exactly.
And why is ours not being revered as highly as yours? It's the same thing. It's playing God with DNA or playing God with making babies. That was an interesting take because that guy had won the Nobel Prize for it.
And to answer your question, again, it depends on like what statistics you're looking at, what the publication is, but so they kind of separate under 35 globally. It's about 40% and drops down over 40s can be like down to like 25%. And then there's also, I'm not a statistician, but as you increase rounds, your percentage chance goes up because you're doing multiple attempts. The same way if you flip a coin 10 times, you're more likely to get a heads at least once than you are if you only flip it one time. And it's another thing about it. It's a numbers game and it kind of messes with your head. The statistics, you're making a lot of really important decisions based purely on statistics and numbers and opinions and medical records. And at the end of the day, good old luck.
Yeah.
Huge part of it. And so I think, because I think in nowadays, at least in, let's say, the United States, or maybe in our circles, people who don't know as much about it, they're like, oh, well, you can just do IVF. But they don't realize that it's really, 40%, that's 2 out of 5 is working for you. That's not a great percentage.
And I don't have experience with it, and you can speak more to this if you want, but the injections and hormonal injections you have to go through and the actual harvesting of the egg and all these procedures you need to go through and the time waiting to make sure you're in the right chemical space to get the egg out and put it back in. And then the money, the cost of it, there's a huge financial cost and there's a huge time cost to it as well. So all that with like these little tiny chances.
It's an absolutely gigantic emotional, financial, and physical burden for a chance at getting pregnant. Never mind then getting through the pregnancy, at a chance for getting pregnant.
And these first women, there was no chance, less than 1% chance because it had never been done before. So now there's it's been done. There's proof it can happen. There's more of a hope. There's more of a chance. There's more of a reason to do it. But back then, these women had no idea, and it was so experimental, and they didn't know if the baby would come out normal, quote unquote, whatever that means. There was a whole conversation about it being deformed. It's a huge risk, a huge chance, but it can yield little babies.
I don't know if we're ready to move on to the moment of stillness, but I think that's a perfect segue because, God, I was like, I'll pull myself together until this last part here. But the quote I said here, and I think those scenes with the original like Ovum Club were to me the most kind of poignant of the whole film, aside from probably one of the last shots of Jean Purdy in the bathroom. But the scenes of the women together, and the quote that came to mind for me is "Stand on the shoulders of giants." And we talked a lot from a doctor perspective about how they started. And there's a whole line about like, well, we start and someone else carries on. That's how medicine works. We can put 20 years into this and then somebody else needs to like continue it. But I was kind of waiting to talk about, I'm going to start.
I know. Well, you just reminded me of the shower scene with Jean, and I'm like, oh God.
I know, in the bathroom there. But I was just sitting there thinking, because they had these lines that were like, and they said from the beginning, like, just so you know, this most likely will not work. Like, and they had conversations both between each other and then between the couples. And they said, we're not doing it for us. We're doing it for the people after. And I just sat there last night thinking, that's me. They did it for me. And so it's not just the doctors. I really want to talk about those women who did this.
Yeah. Oh my God, Cori.
I was like, I'm going to hold it together except for this last part. But, they did something so selfless and even more invasive and horrible than what you have to go through nowadays. And yes, they did it because they had a ray of hope, or they would do, they just wanted a chance, but they knew and they were told, and they did it anyway, knowing it probably wouldn't help them. And for most of them, it didn't. And they did it anyway.
Well,
And
none of the original Ovum Club, none of them.
yeah, none of the original it worked for. It was like that second round. And I guess they said there were 2 babies, another baby named Alistair born. And then they said in total from like the people they worked with, I don't know, 200 or 300 women. They had like 5 babies out of that. I mean, if you look at that percentage, and, I just sat there like immensely thankful for what they did. And, the kind of afterwards, when they show the pictures of the real people and everything, and they're saying now, it gives you the statistics and stuff. And it said, and as of the making the movie, like 12 million babies have been born through IVF. And I was just thinking like, oh, one of them's mine.
One of them's yours.
And so I think this, obviously this is why 3 people recommended it to me.
Clearly.
Because they knew it was a movie made for me. But I think I tried to be very like detached and stoic while watching, because I was like, otherwise I'm just going to be in tears the entire film. But I think the appreciation I had for both the scientists who kept going, and also the women who did it not for themselves, like they did it for me and all my friends going through this right now. And there's nothing you can really do to thank them for that. And anyway, okay, I'm gonna let you talk now.
Well, I can't. No, you did the best. Just I will say thank you to them. That's going to be my moment of stillness. Is just saying thank you to all of them, because your daughter is amazing and she's beautiful, and I know a lot of other people as well who have gone through IVF and they have wonderful children. Yeah. Thank you to them.
And I think if you're at all interested, it's just an interesting movie, regardless about this scientific process and these scientists and the women who went through this. So definitely worth a check out, even if you have no relation to IVF or the reproductive illness community. I think it was well done. I think it was well shot. The screenplay was lovely. If you like a historical autobiographical drama.
You like to see women's contribution to the world put in the spotlight.
To Jean Purdy as well for what she did. So that's our moment of stillness. You have your tissues ready for this episode. I didn't.
Okay. Cori, take us out.
This has been Still the Podcast Film Reviews, a Via Brooklyn digital production. Be sure to check out the current and past seasons of Still the Podcast for free on Spotify, Apple, and wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts as well.
And finally, follow Still the Podcast on Instagram and Threads at Still the Podcast for updates on new episodes and continued discussions. Also, if you have any suggestions for future episode topics, or you'd like to be a guest on the podcast and cry with us, please feel free to drop us a line on social or submit the form on our website via brooklyn.org. Until next time.
Via Brooklyn Digital.